rights organization in history. Members of the committee sought to repeal paragraph 175 of the Imperial Penal Code, which criminalized gay men. The committee sent a petition twice to the national legislature to repeal the law. Both times it was struck down, and both times it was actually a socialist who took the floor to defend gay rights. In 1909, anti-gay hysteria reached new heights after a few German political figures were accused of being gay. And in response, the legislature attempted to propose extending paragraph 175 to include women. And prior to this, women had been involved in the proposal encouraged many more women to join the struggle. During the November Revolution, the gay liberation movement, which was largely middle class in its leadership, decided to align itself with the working class. And the revolutionary spirit of the working class imbued the movement with new fervor. Hirschfeld expressed this in his public speeches, in which he would stress the importance of socialism. He says, "Socialism means solidarity, community, mutuality, further development of society into a unified body of people, each for all and all for each." The committee sent a delegation to the new republic as soon as it was formed, arguing for a total amnesty that would include the release of inmates who had been imprisoned for being gay. The committee also founded the Institute for Sexual Science, which compiled historical, anthropological, biological, and sociological information on gender and sexuality. It also housed the committee and served as an international gay and lesbian community center. Gay and lesbian subcultures flourished in the early 20th century in Germany up until World War I, when the left was profoundly split. The Social Democrat Party, which had been the most consistent supporter of the gay liberation movement, capitulated to the capitalists in supporting the war. And the revolutionaries then allied themselves with the Communist Party, which upheld the right of people to express a variety of genders and sexual orientations. During World War II, Nazis relentlessly used gay baiting to suppress the revolutionary working class. In 1933, fascists ransacked and burned all of the archival materials that were housed in the Institute for Sexual Science. Nazis tortured and murdered thousands of LGBT people in concentration camps. Around the same time that the Nazis were waging this brutal campaign to suppress LGBT rights in Germany, the seeds of the LGBT liberation movement were being sown in the US. Here I actually want to address a theme that I think came up in Comrade Sasha's talk that I think can't be overstated, which is this misconception that the oppression of LGBT people is historically undifferentiated. And while it's true that in the 60s, right, before Stonewall, many LGBT people did discover their identity in isolation without recourse to a community or to a common language to help them articulate their desires and their struggles. But this myth ignores the ways in which transphobia and homophobia have been institutionalized, and it obscures the fact that the contemporary oppression of LGBT people is a direct product of the historical development of capitalism. The spread of wage labor in the 19th and the 20th centuries drew people from rural communities to cities, granting them a greater level of anonymity and sexual autonomy. World War I facilitated this process, and giving LGBT people the chance to leave behind their families and to enter same-sex environments in the military and in factories where they could meet other people like them. And this actually led to a flourishing of urban LGBT subcultures in the early 20th century, particularly in working-class communities in those cities, and most visibly in rural Renaissance. But the newfound autonomy that wage labor granted to individuals outside the family threatened the status of the nuclear family as the dominant economic unit in society. And so the ruling class had to redefine the nuclear family as the ultimate source of love, security. I don't know what I'm getting this. I'm arguing the whole support part of the topic. So the ruling class had to redefine the nuclear family as the ultimate source of love, devotion, security, and freedom, sexual freedom. And it was necessary for the ruling class to sustain the primacy of the heterosexual, monogamous nuclear family in this way, because it served to privatize wealth and to retain the heteropatriarchy. And so just as capitalism created a public sphere for the formation of next time I'm going to work that into my rehearsal.
Yeah.
So just as capitalism created a public sphere for the formation of LGBT communities, it just as surely relies on the oppression of these communities because, of course, sexual and gender variance threatens the sanctity of the nuclear family. And this is why heteropatriarchy and LGBT oppression are necessary to uphold capitalism. And so the thriving LGBT subcultures of the early 20th century began to dwindle in the 1930s and throughout the McCarthy era, during which reactionary politics and conservative gender ideology permeated all of society. The anti-communist witch hunts of the Red Scare equated gays with communists, leading to the persecution of thousands of LGBT people. Gay baiting was often used to purge suspected communists from government, and under the anti-sodomy laws and the sex psychopath laws of the time, gay men were imprisoned, they were branded as sex offenders, they were subjected to electroshock therapy, they were castrated, they were lobotomized, and they were institutionalized, sometimes for life. And it was within this intensely repressive climate that the first sustained LGBT rights organization in the US, the Mattachine Society, was formed. The man who came up with the idea for the Mattachine is Harry Hay. He lives in England and a member of the Communist Party. And he was also a teacher of Marxism and an active supporter of labor unions and workers' organizations. The civil rights movement had informed his perspective on the disenfranchisement of gay men in the US. And in the 40s, he began forming this theory of gay men as a cultural minority, and he suggested that they should organize to better their condition in society. So in 1951, Hay and 4 other men, Rudy Gernreich, Dale Jennings, Bob Hull, and Chuck Borland, all of whom were actually communists or fellow travelers, formed the Mattachine Society. And the Mattachine Society actually took its name from a secret fraternity in medieval France, comprised of unmarried townsmen who would wear masks and perform dances and rituals depicting peasant protests against their oppressive lords. And the founders of the Mattachine took this name because they too felt like they were a masked people, marginalized in society, but that they too had the power to collectively challenge their oppression. The main aims of the Mattachine Society were to unite LGBT people, to educate the public about LGBT issues, to provide leadership in their communities, and to take militant political action against oppressive and discriminatory legislation. And initially, the organization mainly included men, but women, of course, began to protest their exclusion, and after that, women did begin joining the organization in larger numbers. Because the Mattachine was formed during the peak of the anti-gay witch hunts of the McCarthy era, its members felt that it had to be a clandestine organization. And at first, this fear of police entrapment created an atmosphere of tension in the society. But over time, trust and intimacy began to develop between its members when they realized just how profound this was, right? How in collectively confronting their alienation and their shame and their fear, they could overcome those very things. And for many of them, it was the first time that they were included in a community of people who were willing to listen to them and to accept them for who they were. The members of the Mattachine were anti-racist and they were anti-imperialist. They devoted their lives to fighting all forms of oppression. And identifying themselves as a cultural minority was partly an attempt to express solidarity, actually, with those who were battling racism and anti-Semitism at the time. And the members of the Mattachine were distinct from other LGBT rights activists during that time because they adopted some of the core tenets of socialism, namely the idea that oppression and exploitation are not simply products of individual prejudice or bigotry, but that they are deeply embedded in the structure of class society, and that liberation comes through collective resistance. In 1952, one of the founders of the Mattachine, Dale Jennings, was arrested by a cop who was pretending to be gay. And prior to his trial, Mattachine began this huge campaign to protest abusive police practices. They distributed leaflets in public in which they made clear that the moment a segment of the population is denied rights, the rights of all are threatened. Instead of pleading guilty, which nearly everybody who found themselves in his position did at the time, Jennings affirmed his sexuality and indicted the cop who arrested him as the true criminal. The charges against him were eventually dropped. And of course, this was no small victory for LGBT activists at that time, but when the Mattachine tried to publicize the results of the trial, not a single newspaper or broadcasting station was willing to take up the story. In 1953, Hay was red-baited as a former teacher of Marxism. At this time, the Mattachine continued to expand its membership, but many of the new members were right-wingers who feared being red-baited. They criticized the Mattachine for its secrecy and called for a convention to discuss rebuilding the society as an above-ground organization. They also proposed an anti-communism pledge as a condition of membership. And the more reactionary members argued that the Mattachine should not take militant political action, and that gender and sexual orientation was actually irrelevant to their rights as people, which, of course, is a ridiculous thing to claim, given that it was on that very basis that they were being denied their rights. And the reactionary opposition put forth a new constitution, taking an explicit anti-communist stance, and totally eradicating the visionary language of its founders. And this conflict dealt a fatal blow to Mattachine. Hay and the original founders decided to resign from the organization after the convention, and membership began to dwindle steadily, and the Mattachine eventually lost all of its revolutionary character. So, in addition to this reactionary current, I think there are a few other limitations to the Mattachine Society that we should all take into consideration. Its focus on defining LGBT people as a cultural minority obscures the fact that, of course, people within the LGBT community experience different levels of social and economic oppression, as well as different kinds of national oppression. The leadership of the Mattachine was predominantly white and middle class, so it couldn't unite with the most oppressed and the most revolutionary members of society. Its middle and upper class members adopted this conciliatory approach to organizing. They turned to professionals and establishment figures to appeal for their rights rather than taking militant action. They were concerned with placating the reactionary opposition and were ultimately responsible for the dissolution of the revolutionary spirit of the organization. But despite these limitations, I think that the strengths of the Mattachine Society can be found in the guiding principles of its founders, specifically in how they address the question of who in society we should turn to lead the struggle for radical change. The leaders of the Mattachine Society hope to imbue LGBT people with the conviction that radical change was possible as long as they stood in solidarity with workers and oppressed nations who also faced police brutality and institutionalized discrimination. The founders were revolutionaries, right? They believed that LGBT people were oppressed because of the development of the nuclear family in class society, and they tried to educate the LGBT community about the historical roots of their oppression through this Marxist understanding of capitalism. And most importantly, they understood the fundamental fact that capitalism is built on oppression, and therefore that the LGBT liberation struggle has to be part of the overall process for destroying capitalism. And it's for these reasons that I think we can't forget that the Mattachine, despite the turn it took, had revolutionary origins, which was as momentous for the repressive times that it was formed in. And we have to remember to think critically about the historical roots of our oppression, and we have to remember that exploitation and oppression are systemic features of class society, and that liberation can only come through collective militant struggle.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Jennifer. So I failed to introduce myself personally earlier. I was focused on introducing the workers group. My name is Sally Jane Black. I'm a queer trans working woman and a member of the workers group. And I'm going to pick up